The rain in Los Angeles was coming down hard, turning the usually busy streets into a blur of gray and red tail lights. It was the kind of weather that made everyone want to stay inside, but for Keanu Reeves, it was just another Tuesday. He was riding his prized motorcycle, leaning into the curves with the ease of someone who has spent decades on two wheels. The water didn't bother him much. In fact, the cold spray against his face felt grounding. He wasn't heading to a movie set or a glamorous premiere. He was riding toward a building made of glass and steel that held his name on the ownership papers, yet felt strangely foreign to him. This was the headquarters of his production company. It was a place built to turn creative ideas into movies, but lately, it had started to feel more like a bank than a studio. Keanu had been feeling a growing distance between himself and the people running the day-to-day operations. He wasn't just an actor, he was a builder. He cared about the stories they told and the people who helped tell them. But lately, every report he saw was full of spreadsheets and profit margins, with very little talk about the art. That was why he was going there in person. He didn't want a Zoom call. He didn't want an email summary. He wanted to look his team in the eye and remind them why they started this company in the first place. He pulled up to the sleek, modern building and parked his bike in a spot near the back, away from the reserved spaces for luxury cars. He didn't want the hassle of blocking traffic or having someone fuss over his vehicle. He killed the engine and the silence of the parking lot rushed in, broken only by the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of rain falling from his helmet to the pavement. Keanu sat there for a moment, taking a deep breath. He was carrying the weight of a new project. He believed in a project that wasn't a blockbuster action movie, but a heartfelt story he knew could resonate with people. He needed the executives to understand its value. He climbed off the bike, unzipped his heavy leather jacket, and tucked his helmet under his arm. He looked like any other guy running an errand in the city. His boots were scuffed, his jeans were faded, and his beard was a bit scruffy. There was no entourage, no bodyguards, and no screaming fans. It was just Keanu. He liked it that way. He valued his privacy and his freedom more than anything else, and he hated the idea of his fame making other people uncomfortable. He walked toward the entrance, head down slightly against the rain, pushing through the heavy glass doors. Inside, the air was crisp and smelled of expensive coffee and floor polish. It was quiet, too quiet for a place that was supposed to be creating movie magic. As he walked across the lobby, the security guard looked up from a monitor. The guard looked at the wet leather, the messy hair, and the tired eyes. He didn't see the star of The Matrix or John Wick. He just saw a guy who looked like he'd been caught in a storm. The guard gave a polite but dismissive nod and went back to his screen, assuming Keanu was a courier or perhaps a friend of one of the editors. Keanu didn't correct him. He just offered a small, tight smile and kept walking. He headed for the elevators, pressing the button for the top floor. As the silver doors slid shut, trapping him in the mirrored box, he caught a glimpse of his own reflection. He looked tired. It had been a long few months of filming, late nights and traveling. But beneath the fatigue, there was a look of determination. He wasn't here to be a celebrity today. He was here to be a boss, even though it was a role he never really felt comfortable playing. The elevator dinged softly, arriving at the executive suite. The doors opened, revealing a hallway that was even quieter than the lobby. The walls were lined with framed movie posters from their past successes, but the atmosphere felt cold. It felt sterile. Keanu stepped out, his boots making no sound on the thick, plush carpet. He could hear the faint hum of computers and the distant ring of a phone, but there was no laughter. There was no shouting about plot holes or excitement over a new script. It felt like a library where no one was reading. He walked toward the reception desk at the center of the floor. This was where the gatekeepers sat, the people who decided who got to see the bosses and who got turned away. Behind the desk sat a sharply dressed young woman with a headset on. She was typing furiously, her eyes locked on her screen, completely absorbed in whatever task she was doing. Keanu walked up to the desk and stood there. He waited. He stood there for a full minute. He wasn't impatient, he was used to waiting. He spent his whole life waiting on sets, waiting for lights to be set up, waiting for the director to say action. But this waiting felt different. It felt like he was invisible. He watched as the woman clicked her mouse, sighed at something on the screen, and took a sip of her coffee, never once looking up. The rain from his jacket was dripping onto the pristine counter, forming a small puddle, but she didn't notice that either. Keanu shifted his weight. He knew that if he cleared his throat or knocked on the desk, she would likely jump and apologize. But he wanted to see how long it would go on. He wanted to see if she would ever actually acknowledge the human presence standing right in front of her. It was a small test, but it told him everything he needed to know about the culture that had taken over his company. They had stopped seeing people, they only saw schedules and interruptions. He didn't want to cause a scene, not yet. He believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was dealing with a crisis. Maybe a deadline was looming. So, he just waited there in his wet clothes, helmet in hand, feeling more like a ghost in his own office than a man who had the power to fire everyone in the building with a single sentence. The silence stretched on, heavy and awkward, at least for him. The receptionist, however, seemed perfectly content in her own little world, unaware that the owner of the company was watching her, waiting for just a shred of common courtesy. The silence in the hallway stretched on, thick and uncomfortable, but Keanu Reeves didn't move. He just stood there, water dripping from the hem of his jacket onto the expensive carpet. Finally, the receptionist let out a loud, exaggerated sigh, the kind people make when they feel their important time is being wasted. She yanked her headset off and tossed it onto the desk without looking at him, spinning her chair around to face the counter. When her eyes finally landed on him, they didn't light up with recognition. Instead, they narrowed with suspicion. She looked at his wet, messy hair, the scuffed boots, and the helmet tucked under his arm. To her, he wasn't the owner of the company. He wasn't the man who had funded this building. He was just another guy from the street who had wandered up to the wrong floor. "We don't accept walk-ins," she said abruptly. Her voice was sharp, lacking any warmth. "If you are here for a delivery, the loading dock is around the back of the building. You can't bring that bike gear up here. It's unprofessional." Keanu blinked, tilting his head slightly. He wasn't angry, just surprised. "I'm not here for a delivery," he said softly, his voice raspy and low. "I have a meeting. A scheduled meeting." The receptionist rolled her eyes and turned back to her computer monitor, typing furiously again. "Name and don't bother giving me a fake name. I have the schedule right here." "Keanu Reeves," he said simply. The woman stopped typing for a split second, let out a short, mocking laugh, and kept typing. "Right. Sure. And I'm the Queen of England." She didn't even check the list. She just assumed he was lying. "Look, buddy. The executives are very busy. They are in a strategic session. They don't have time for autographs or auditions. If you're an extra waiting for a call, go to the lounge downstairs. If you're a courier, drop the package and leave. Keanu looked at her for a long moment. He wanted to tell her who he was, but something held him back. He realized that if he did, she wouldn't apologize for being rude, she would just be scared. She would only care about his status, not about how she had treated a human being. This wasn't about his ego. It was about the fact that she felt comfortable treating anyone famous or not with such disrespect in his building. "Okay," Keanu said quietly. "I'll wait." "Fine," she snapped, pointing a manicured finger toward a row of cheap chairs against the far wall. "Sit there. And don't make a mess. If they have time for you, they'll call you. But don't hold your breath." Keanu walked over to the waiting area. The chairs were plastic and uncomfortable, a stark contrast to the plush leather couches in the executive suite just a few feet away. He sat down, placing his helmet carefully on the floor next to him. He leaned back, crossing his arms, and settled in. The rain outside was still beating against the glass, but inside, the air was dry and tense. As he sat there, the office began to wake up around him. People started walking back and forth in the hallway. These were junior assistants, interns, and low-level staffers. They looked tired. Their eyes were red from staring at screens, and they carried coffees and stacks of papers like they were shield and sword. Keanu watched them closely. He saw a young man drop a stack of files, papers scattering everywhere. The boy scrambled to pick them up, looking terrified that someone would see. A man in a sharp suit, likely a junior executive, walked past, didn't even stop to help, and instead scolded the boy for being clumsy. Keanu felt a knot form in his stomach. This wasn't the company he wanted to build. He wanted a place where people helped each other, where creativity came before ego. But looking around, all he saw was fear. The lower-level employees were scared of the people in the big offices. They were treated like robots rather than collaborators. He stayed in the plastic chair for a long time. Minutes ticked by, turning into 20, then 30 minutes. He was patient. He had spent hours in makeup chairs, waiting for explosions to be set up, waiting for the sun to go down. Waiting was part of the job. But as he sat there, he began to hear voices coming from behind the heavy oak doors of the main boardroom. The doors were thick, but they weren't soundproof. The laughter was the first thing that pierced through. It was loud, arrogant laughter. It wasn't the sound of people having fun, it was the sound of people feeling powerful. It was the laugh of someone who knows they are the king of the castle. Keanu listened. He couldn't make out every word at first, but the tone was clear. They were joking. They were relaxed. They were drinking what smelled like expensive coffee, completely unaware that the owner of the company was sitting just a few yards away on a cheap plastic chair. He looked at the receptionist. She was back on her phone, ignoring him completely. He looked at the terrified intern who had dropped the papers, now sitting silently at a desk with his head in his hands. Then he looked back at the boardroom doors. The disconnect was massive. The people inside that room were living in a bubble, protected from the reality of the work their employees were doing. They were cutting costs and boosting numbers, but they had no idea what the actual culture of the office felt like. Keanu shifted in his seat. The leather of his jacket was starting to dry, feeling stiff and cold against his skin. He rubbed his face, feeling the stubble on his chin. He had come here to talk about a new movie, a passion project that meant a lot to him. He needed money and approval from the very people laughing behind that door. But the longer he sat there, the less he felt like asking for permission. He felt like he had walked into a stranger's house. Suddenly, the noise from the boardroom got louder. Someone had opened a door inside the suite, creating a clear path for the sound to travel. A voice boomed out, a deep, confident voice that belonged to the man Keanu had hired as the CEO years ago. "Honestly, I don't care what the vision is," the CEO's voice echoed. "We need to slash the budget on that next film. Crew costs are too high. Who cares if they complain? Let them find other jobs. If the talent doesn't like it, we'll find someone else. Everyone is replaceable." Keanu froze. He sat up straighter, his eyes locked on the wood grain of the boardroom door. The voice continued, dripping with arrogance. "And that script Keanu sent over, the one he's so excited about, it's a joke. It's too emotional. Too soft. We can market it, sure, but we're going to cut the heart out of it to make it sell. He won't know the difference. He's too busy riding his motorcycle in the rain to notice." The other people in the room laughed. It was a cruel sound. Keanu didn't move. He didn't stand up and storm the door. Not yet. He just sat there, absorbing the words. They weren't just talking about money. They were talking about him like he was a naive child who couldn't be trusted with his own dreams. They were planning to butcher the story he loved, the story he wanted to tell the world. And they were planning to mistreat the crew, the hard-working people who actually built the sets and carried the equipment. He looked down at his hands. They were rough, scarred from years of action movies and stunts. He knew what hard work looked like. He knew what it felt like to be on a set, cold and tired, giving everything you had. The people in that room didn't know. They only knew spreadsheets. The receptionist looked up, annoyed by the noise from the boardroom. "Excuse me," she shouted toward the open door. "Some people are trying to work out here." She immediately picked up her phone and dialed an extension. "Sorry to bother you, sir," she said into the phone, her voice suddenly sickly sweet and respectful. "Yes, it's the front desk." No, everything is fine. Just checking on your lunch order." "Okay, great." She hung up and looked at Keanu with a smirk, as if to show him how important she was compared to him. "You can go now," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "They are clearly busy. Come back another day. Or better yet, don't." Keanu looked at the door, then back at the woman. He slowly stood up. He didn't look like a tired guy on a motorcycle anymore. He stood up straight, his shoulders back. The wait was over. He had heard enough. He wasn't leaving. He was going in. Keanu didn't sit back down. Instead, he took a slow, deep breath, letting the air fill his lungs and center his thoughts. The anger he felt was cold and sharp, not hot and wild. He wasn't the kind of person to yell and throw things, that wasn't who he was. But he was the kind of person who knew when a line had been crossed. And hearing his own passion project called a joke, and hearing the crew he worked with called replaceable, was that line. He looked at the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. They were tall and imposing, designed to make anyone standing outside feel small. But to Keanu, they were just wood. They were just a barrier between a fake reality and the truth. He could hear the murmur of voices continuing on the other side, the clink of glass, and the rustle of papers. They were in there, safe and warm, deciding the fate of people's lives without knowing anything about them. He stood still for a moment, listening intently. The voices inside had lowered again, but the acoustics of the hallway were strange. He could hear the CEO's voice distinct and clear, cutting through the others like a knife. The man was speaking about the budget cuts again. "We need to trim the fat," the CEO said, his voice dripping with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. "The production crews on the new film are demanding too many breaks. Too many safety regulations. It's slowing us down. If they want to work, they work by our rules. If not, there are 100 people waiting to take their spot. It's simple economics." Keanu closed his eyes for a second. He thought about the stuntmen he knew. He thought about the camera operators who carried heavy equipment on their shoulders for 12 hours a day. He thought about the makeup artists and the costume designers. These weren't numbers on a page. They were people. They had families. They had dreams. They got hurt. They got tired. To call them fat that needed to be trimmed was disgusting. It was a lack of humanity that made Keanu's skin crawl. Then, the conversation shifted. The name of the script dropped again. Keanu leaned in closer to the door, his hand resting lightly on the brass handle, but he didn't turn it yet. "And that script," another voice chimed in. This one sounded like a high-level producer. "The one Keanu is so obsessed with. The story about the retired musician. It's boring. It has no explosions. No fights. How do we sell that?" "We don't sell the movie," the CEO laughed. "We sell Keanu. We put his face on the poster, we cut a trailer that makes it look like an action thriller, and we trick the audience into buying tickets. Once they are in the theater, who cares? We have their money. Keanu gets his check, we get our profit, and the audience, well, they will get over it. We'll tell him we made creative adjustments for the market. He's too nice to cause a fuss. He'll sign the papers and go back to playing with his motorcycles." Keanu's grip on the door handle tightened, his knuckles turned white. That was the part that hurt the most. They weren't just disrespecting the art, they were counting on his kindness to exploit him. They thought his politeness was weakness. They thought because he didn't scream at servers or yell at paparazzi, he was stupid. They thought they could manipulate him because he trusted people. That trust had just been shattered into a million pieces. He looked back at the receptionist. She was watching him now, a look of annoyance on her face. She thought he was lingering, hoping to catch a glimpse of a star. She stood up, smoothing her skirt, ready to tell him to leave again. "Sir, I told you," she started, her voice high and shrill. "You need to leave. You are loitering. I'm going to call security if you don't vacate the premises right now." Keanu turned his head slowly to look at her. His eyes were dark, and for the first time, there was no smile in them. "Go ahead," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that made her stop mid-sentence. "Call security. But I'm not leaving. Not yet." The receptionist hesitated. There was something about the way he said it, so calm, so sure, that gave her pause. She picked up her phone but didn't dial, her fingers hovering over the buttons. Keanu turned back to the door. He realized now that waiting any longer was pointless. He wasn't going to be invited in. He wasn't going to be greeted with respect. He had to take the respect he deserved. He thought about all the times he had been on set, early in the morning, before anyone else arrived. He thought about the times he had sat in the dirt with the crew, eating the same boxed lunch, listening to their stories. That was real. This office, with its glass walls and sharp suits, was the fake world. Inside the room, the CEO was still talking. "I'm telling you, we are geniuses. We can turn this mess into gold. And by the time Keanu realizes what we did, we will have already moved on to the next project. He's just an actor. He doesn't understand the business. Keanu had heard enough. The insults to his intelligence were one thing. The insults to his project were another. But the sheer arrogance of thinking that the business was more important than the human spirit was the final straw. This wasn't just a company meeting anymore. This was a wake-up call. He looked at the reflection of himself in the small glass window of the door. He saw the wet hair, the beard, the leather jacket. He didn't look like a billionaire. He didn't look like a movie star. He looked like a man who was tired of being lied to. He didn't need to scream to be powerful. True power was walking into a room and changing the temperature without raising your voice. The receptionist was dialing now, whispering into the phone, looking nervous. Keanu ignored her. He focused entirely on the task at hand. He was about to walk into a room full of people who thought they were better than him, better than the crew, better than the audience. He was about to ruin their day. And for the first time that morning, he felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't anxious. He was ready. He thought about the crew members again. The people who would lose their jobs if these budget cuts went through. He thought about the audience, who would pay their hard-earned money to see a movie that was made with deceit. He was standing there not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated by someone in a suit. The laughter from inside the room grew louder again. They were celebrating a plan that was built on lies. Keanu took his hand off the handle for a second and wiped his palm on his jeans. He wanted to be steady. He wanted to be calm. Because when the door opened, he didn't want them to see a madman. He wanted them to see the consequence of their actions. He wanted them to see the owner. The receptionist put the phone down and came around the desk, puffing out her chest, trying to look authoritative. "Sir. This is your last warning." Keanu didn't even look at her. He pushed the handle down. It was cool and smooth under his hand. The mechanism clicked, a heavy, metallic sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the hallway. He pushed the door open. The air rushed out of the room, carrying with it the smell of expensive cologne and hot coffee. The noise from inside stopped instantly as the door swung inward. Keanu stepped over the threshold, his boots making a heavy thud on the polished wood floor. He didn't say a word immediately. He just stood there, filling the doorway, letting the silence stretch, letting them look at him and realize exactly who had just walked into their trap. The contrast between the hallway and the boardroom was shocking. In the hallway, it was tense and cold. In here, it was overly warm, the heaters blasting to keep the executives comfortable while the rest of the building was drafty. The long mahogany table was polished to a shine, covered in papers, laptops, and half-eaten pastries. The windows offered a stunning view of the city, but none of these people were looking at it. They were all looking at him. Keanu stood tall, rain still dripping from his jacket onto their pristine floor. He scanned the faces around the table. He saw the CEO, a man with a sleek haircut and a watch that cost more than a car. He saw the producers, the lawyers, the marketers. They all had looks of shock, confusion, and then, slowly, dawning horror. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just stood there, a silent judge entering the courtroom. The receptionist was behind him in the hallway, frozen, finally realizing that the man she had yelled at was the person signing her paychecks. But Keanu's eyes were fixed on the people at the table. The game was over. The charade was done. He was done waiting. The silence that fell over the room was heavy, the kind of silence that feels physically heavy, like the air pressure had suddenly dropped. It was so quiet that the sound of water dripping from Keanu's jacket onto the expensive hardwood floor sounded like a hammer hitting a nail. Every person in the room froze. Pens stopped moving. Coffee cups hovered halfway to mouths. Eyes widened as they tried to process what they were seeing. At the head of the long, polished table sat the CEO. He was a man who spent his life in expensive suits, someone who prided himself on control and power. When the door first opened, he hadn't even looked up. He assumed it was the assistant coming back with his lunch order. But when the silence stretched on, he snapped his head up, annoyance flashing in his eyes. He looked at the figure standing in the doorway. He saw the wet, messy hair. He saw the beaten-up leather jacket and the jeans that had seen better days. He saw the helmet tucked under one arm. To him, this wasn't a person, it was a problem. It was a disruption to his carefully scheduled afternoon. "Can I help you?" the CEO barked. His voice was loud and harsh, echoing off the glass walls. He didn't wait for an answer. "This is a private meeting. You can't just walk in here." "Who let you up?" The other executives around the table shifted in their chairs. They looked from the stranger to their boss, waiting for security to arrive. Some of them started to smirk, enjoying the spectacle of their boss tearing into a trespasser. Keanu didn't speak. He just stood there, his expression calm but his eyes intense. He took a slow step into the room. The smell of rain and street air followed him, clashing with the scent of expensive cologne and fresh pastries. "I said, get out!" the CEO shouted, standing up. He was a tall man, and he used his height to try to intimidate people. He walked around the table, heading straight for Keanu. He didn't recognize the man in front of him. In his world, the owner of the company was a concept, a name on a contract, someone you met in a boardroom wearing a suit, not a guy in a motorcycle jacket. "You're trespassing. I'm calling the police." Keanu walked a few more steps into the center of the room, near the table. He gently placed his helmet on the surface of the expensive table. The helmet was worn and scratched, a testament to years of use. It sat there, looking out of place among the pristine laptops and designer coffee cups. "This is private property," the CEO yelled, getting right in Keanu's face. He was furious now. He saw the helmet on the table and saw red. "Get your dirty gear off my table. Do you have any idea who we are? We are running a business here." The CEO reached out to shove the helmet off the table, his hand moving aggressively. In his anger, he miscalculated. Instead of pushing the helmet, his foot kicked the heavy boot of Keanu, who was standing firmly in place. The CEO stumbled slightly, caught off balance, and lashed out to steady himself, his hand slapping against the wet leather of Keanu's jacket. "Get this trash out of here!" the CEO screamed, turning to the other people in the room. "Why is no one stopping him?" Just then, the receptionist appeared in the doorway behind Keanu. She was pale, her hand covering her mouth in horror. She realized too late what was happening. She saw the back of the man standing in the room, the slouch of the shoulders, the texture of his hair, and her blood ran cold. "Sir," she whispered, her voice trembling. That isn't a delivery guy." The CEO ignored her. He turned back to Keanu, his face twisted in a sneer. "I don't care who he is. He's ruining my meeting. You're fired, buddy. Now get out before I have you dragged out." Keanu finally moved. He didn't step back. He didn't raise his hands to fight. He simply reached up and slowly took off his baseball cap, tucking it into his pocket. Then, he looked the CEO directly in the eye. The room was spinning for the CEO, but Keanu was a statue. "I heard everything," Keanu said. His voice was soft, but it cut through the tension like a laser. "I heard you talking about the crew. I heard you talking about the script. And I heard you talking about me." The CEO froze. The voice. The calmness. The face. Suddenly, the fog of arrogance lifted from his eyes. He really looked at the man standing in front of him. He saw the kindness in the eyes that had been on the big screen for decades. He saw the jawline, the scars, the familiar sadness. The color drained from the CEO's face so fast he looked like he might faint. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He took a stumbling step backward, nearly tripping over his own expensive Italian shoes. "Keanu," one of the other executives whispered from the table. "Oh my God. It's Keanu Reeves?" The name rippled through the room like a shockwave. Heads snapped back. People dropped their phones. The smirks vanished instantly, replaced by sheer terror. They all realized, at the exact same moment, that the man they had been mocking for the last hour, the man they called stupid and soft, was standing 3 feet away from them. And he had heard every word. The CEO's face turned a bright shade of red. He started to sweat. The arrogance evaporated, replaced by panic. He tried to switch gears instantly. It was a pathetic thing to watch. His forced smile was twitchy and wrong. "Keanu. Wow. I didn't recognize you. You look so different. So casual." He let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh that sounded like a bark. We were just role-playing. Yes. We were preparing for a difficult negotiation. I didn't mean it. None of us did. We love your script. It's brilliant." He reached out to pat Keanu on the shoulder, a gesture of familiarity that was entirely unwelcome. "We were just testing ideas. Stress testing the budget. You know how it is. Just business talk." Keanu looked at the hand on his shoulder, then back at the CEO's face. He didn't move away, but he didn't return the smile. "You called my script a joke," Keanu said quietly. "You said you were going to cut the heart out of it. You said I was too stupid to notice." The CEO's hand fell away. No, you misunderstood. That was a character voice. I was acting. I was pretending to be a villain for the movie." Keanu turned his gaze to the rest of the table. They were all avoiding his eyes, looking at their papers, the floor, anywhere but him. The silence was deafening. He could feel the fear radiating off them. They weren't sorry they said it, they were just sorry they got caught. They were sorry the talent was in the room. "You called the crew fat that needs to be trimmed," Keanu continued. "You talked about them like they were numbers. Those are people. Good people. They work harder than anyone in this room. We value the crew." A woman near the end of the table blurted out. Her voice was shaking. We were frustrated about the timeline. We didn't mean it." Keanu looked at her, then back at the CEO. The CEO was wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. "Look, Keanu," the CEO stammered, his voice cracking. "Let us sit down. We can order you lunch. Let us talk about this like reasonable adults. I'm sure we can explain everything. I was out of line. I apologize. Really, I do." Keanu looked around the room one last time. He saw the expensive furniture. He saw the uneaten lunches. He saw the fear. But mostly, he saw the lack of respect. He saw a group of people who had lost their way. They had forgotten that movies aren't about spreadsheets, they are about people. They had forgotten who they were working for. He didn't sit down. He didn't want their lunch. He didn't want their fake apologies. The character the CEO had been playing when he thought the door was closed, Keanu knew that was the real character. The man sweating and stammering, now that was the mask. Keanu picked up his helmet from the table. He held it firmly in his hand. He looked at the CEO and shook his head slowly, a look of deep disappointment on his face. It was a look that said, "I expected better." "You don't have to explain anything," Keanu said. "I heard everything I needed to hear. And I saw everything I needed to see." The CEO swallowed hard, his throat clicking. "So, what do we do now? We start over, we have a fresh start." Keanu took a deep breath. The air in the room felt stale and toxic. He was done with this room. He was done with these people. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He just spoke the truth with a calm certainty that terrified them more than any scream could. "No," Keanu said. "We don't start over. You're done." The two words hung in the air like a heavy stone dropped into a still pond. The ripples of shock hit everyone in the room at different speeds. The CEO stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, trying to process if he had heard correctly. His brain was scrambling to find a way out, a loophole, a joke, anything that would make this moment go back to how it was 5 minutes ago when he was the king of the castle. What do you mean, done?" the CEO stammered, forcing a laugh that sounded like a choke. "You can't fire us. We have contracts. We are the executive team. We run this company. You can't just walk in here and—" "I can," Keanu said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was final. It was the same voice he used when he delivered a line that ended a movie scene. There was no room for argument. "I own this place. All of it. The building, the logo, the rights to the movies. And I own the contracts you signed. Which, if I remember correctly, have a clause about moral turpitude and bringing disrespect to the brand." He looked around the room at the other executives, who were shrinking into their expensive chairs. "You sat in this room and planned to lie to me. You planned to cheat the audience. You treated the people who work for you like they were nothing. That is not the company I built. That is not who we are." The CEO's face turned a dark shade of purple. He slammed his hand on the table, making the water in Keanu's helmet rattle. "You're making a mistake. You don't understand business. You need us. You're just an actor. You'll be back asking for help in a week when you realize you can't handle this." Keanu didn't even blink. He didn't get angry. He just looked at the man with a look of pity. It was terrifyingly calm. "I understand business better than you do," Keanu said softly. "Business is about trust. It's about relationships. It's about making something good together. You think it's about numbers. You're wrong. And I don't need you to show me how to be wrong." He turned to the door where the receptionist was standing, along with two security guards who had finally arrived. The guards looked confused, looking back and forth between the famous actor and the yelling suit. Keanu pointed to the CEO, then to the vice presidents, and to the lawyers sitting at the table. "These people are leaving. Please escort them out. They are not to come back. Their key cards should be deactivated right now." The guards hesitated for a split second. It was one thing to remove a drunk person from the lobby, it was another thing to physically remove the CEO of the company. But Keanu nodded at them, a silent command that told them he was taking full responsibility. The guards stepped forward, looking serious. "You can't do this," the CEO screamed, his voice cracking. The mask was completely gone now. There was no confidence left, only the panic of a fallen king. "I will sue you. I will take everything you have." "Try," Keanu said simply, "but get out of my chair first." The CEO looked at Keanu, then at the guards, and realized there was no way out. The fantasy was over. He grabbed his briefcase, his hands shaking so badly he could barely latch it. The other executives scrambled to gather their things, dropping papers, knocking over chairs in their haste. It was a chaotic, ungraceful exit. 10 seconds ago, they were powerful executives, now, they looked like naughty children being sent to the principal's office. As they filed past Keanu, none of them could look him in the eye. They stared at their shoes, their faces burning with shame. The CEO was the last to leave. He stopped in front of Keanu, his face red and sweaty. He wanted to say something mean, something to hurt Keanu, but the words died in his throat. He saw the resolve in Keanu's eyes and knew he had lost. He lowered his head and walked out, followed closely by the guards. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them. Silence returned to the room, but this time it wasn't a cold, tense silence. It was a silence that felt like a clean slate. Keanu stood alone in the middle of the huge boardroom. He let out a long breath he felt like he'd been holding for months. He looked at the table, littered with the debris of the fired executives' half-drunk coffees, scribbled notes about cutting budgets, expensive pens. It looked like a graveyard of bad ideas. He walked over to the window and looked out at the city. The rain had stopped, and the sun was trying to break through the clouds. It felt symbolic. He turned around and walked out of the boardroom, leaving his helmet on the table as a paperweight for the mess left behind. When he stepped back into the main office area, the atmosphere was electric. The receptionist was sitting at her desk, looking like she might cry. The junior staff members, the assistants, the interns, the people who had been running around stressed all morning were frozen at their desks, watching him. Keanu walked over to the receptionist. She shrank back into her chair, terrified she was next. "Hey," Keanu said gently. "I'm not going to fire you." She let out a sob of relief. "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't know it was you. I was just doing my job, they told us to keep people out." "You were rude," Keanu said, but his tone was kind, not angry. "But you were listening to the people above you. That stops now. We're going to change how things work here. We're going to treat people with respect. Even the ones in leather jackets." He gave her a small, genuine smile, and she smiled back, wiping her eyes. Then, he turned to the open office floor. He saw the young assistant who had dropped the papers earlier. The kid looked terrified, clutching a stack of files like a shield. Keanu walked over to him. The room went silent. Everyone held their breath, thinking the cleaning of the house wasn't over. "Those look heavy," Keanu said, nodding at the files. The kid nodded, his voice shaking. "Yes, sir. The CFO, the guy who just left, he needed these summaries immediately." "He's gone," Keanu said. "You don't need to run those for him." He reached out and gently took half the stack from the kid's hands. "Where do they go?" To the file room," the kid stammered, confused. "Show me," Keanu said. Together, the movie star and the intern walked toward the file room. The office staff watched in disbelief. The owner of the company, the man who could be at a premiere or on a private island, was helping an intern file papers. Keanu spent the next hour moving through the office. He didn't give a big speech. He didn't stand on a desk and yell. He just talked to people. He asked the graphic designers what they liked to draw. He asked the accountants if the coffee in the break room was any good. He sat on the edge of desks and listened. He found out that the budget cuts the executives were yelling about were actually hurting the morale of the team deeply. He learned that the crew on the set hated the new caterers because the food was cheap and cold. He took notes on a notepad he found. A real, yellow notepad. By the end of the afternoon, the energy in the building had completely changed. The fear was gone, replaced by a buzz of curiosity and hope. People were standing up straighter. They were smiling at each other. Finally, Keanu made his way back to the lobby. He had things to do. He needed to call the crew and tell them their budgets were safe. He needed to find a new team, people who actually cared about stories. But first, he needed to ride. He picked up his helmet from the boardroom table on his way out. The room was empty now, cleaned out by the staff who were happy to see the old regime's trash thrown in the bin. He walked to the elevator, pressed the button for the ground floor, and stepped inside. As the doors closed, he caught his reflection in the polished steel walls. He looked the same as he had that morning: scruffy beard, leather jacket, tired eyes. But he felt different. He felt lighter. He walked out of the building into the cool evening air. His bike was parked where he left it. He put on his helmet, swung his leg over the seat, and keyed the ignition. The engine roared to life, a deep, throaty sound that echoed off the glass walls of the building. The security guard at the gate, the one who had ignored him that morning, stood up straight and saluted. It was a sign of respect, not for a celebrity, but for a leader who had actually done something. Keanu gave a small wave. He didn't look back at the office. He looked forward, toward the open road. He kicked the bike into gear and sped off into the traffic, disappearing into the city like a character riding into the sunset. The company was his again. And for the first time in a long time, the future looked bright.